Important briefing. The members are voting right now, so we're going to go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel of guests and let them start. And then hopefully Mr. Scott and Mr. Murphy will be in shortly as soon as they finish voting, okay? So my name is Macias, and I'm from my education fellow with Lieutenant Bobby Scott's office. I want to thank him so much for giving me this opportunity to do this briefing. Tomorrow's my last day on the Hill. I'm a women's research and education fellow, and I've been here for almost 9 months, and I've had a wonderful experience. So I really appreciate Mr. Scott and Team Scott giving me the opportunity to do this briefing on this very important issue. So I'll introduce our wonderful panel right now. Beginning with Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the president and the CEO of the Scotch Foundation for Public Education. He joined the Scotch Foundation after 7 years in leadership positions at the NAACP, including Chief Policy Officer and National Director of Education. He has a JD from the University of Illinois College of Law and received a Doctor of Education in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy from Harvard Graduate School of Education. Jim Freeman is a staff attorney at the Advancement Project. He is the director of the Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse Trap Project and primary author of Test, Push, and Push Out, How Zero Tolerance and High-Stakes Testing Funnels Youth into the School to Prison Pipeline. Jim is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and Harvard Law School, where he was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. Following law school, he served as a judicial law clerk for the Honorable James R. Browning on the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals in San Francisco. He is recipient of the prestigious Satin Fellowship. Damon Hewitt is an attorney and the director of the Education Project of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Damon launched LDF's Dismantling the School to Prison Pipeline Initiative. Damon led LDF's efforts in the series of investigation and public hearings regarding racial disparities and discipline practices throughout Florida's public school districts. Those hearings were followed by a release of a report entitled Arresting Development, Addressing the School Discipline Crisis in Florida. He assisted defense lawyers representing the General Six in addressing their education needs of their clients, some of whom were expelled and kept out of school for over a year. And he is co-author of a forthcoming book, The School to Prison Pipeline, Structuring Legal Reform, which will be published by NYU Press this fall. Thank you, David, for being here. Dr. Ann Gregory is a member of the faculty of Rutgers University's Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. Her work addresses the persistent trend of African American adolescents receiving school suspension and expulsion at higher rates than other students. Through her research and intervention, she aims to address the situation by strengthening characteristics of teachers, classrooms, and schools associated with successful schooling of African American students. And Anne's most recent publications include co-authoring The Achievement Gap, The Achievement Gap and the Discipline Gap, Two Sides of the Same Coin. African American high school students and variability in behavior across classrooms, and tolerating adolescent needs, moving away from zero tolerance policies in high school. Thank you. Caitlin Dunn is the Paul Loring Equal Justice Works Fellow and staff attorney at the ACLU of the nation's capital area. In 2008, she founded the Fair Discipline Project, which is committed to combating unlawful, excessive, and arbitrary school discipline in D.C. public, traditional, and charter schools. Caitlin represents students facing long-term suspension and expulsion from school and advocates for discipline policies that promote positive interventions and enable students to continue their education. Prior to joining the ACLU-NCA, Caitlin was law clerk for the D.C. Employment Justice Center and at the National Partnership for Women and Families. Caitlin received her JD from George Washington University School of Law. Thank you again for coming, and we have Representative Murphy here now, and he will now have his remarks.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for attending today, and thank you to our great panel for the remarks that they're going to give, and hopefully the inspiration that they're going to provide for those of us here in Congress who care deeply about this issue and really want to view everything we do here with respect to education policy, but certainly the ongoing conversation on the reauthorization of ESEA through the prism of how we can return dignity to a lot of schools in which it's been lost. I'm co-sponsoring this along with the leader on this issue, Representative Bobby Scott, who will be here very shortly. Bobby has, for a very long time, really spent his time in Washington trying to open people's eyes to the entire range of youth justice issues, whether it be the condition of our school prisons or the condition of our schools, of our youth prisons in our schools. I'm really indebted to him for all the great work he's done. I come at this having worked on the issue in the state legislature in Connecticut. Connecticut sort of has one foot in the regressive side of this debate, one foot in the progressive side. We remain even today as one of the few states in the nation that has not transferred its 16 and 17-year-olds to the juvenile court. While at the same time, we've taken a leading role in the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline. And some of the things that Connecticut has begun to do and some of the conversations that Connecticut has begun to talk about, I hope will educate some of our conversation here. We know in Connecticut that school districts that have decided to take on the issue of school discipline, that have decided to take on the really unjustifiable levels of suspensions and expulsions for kids in their school system, have had remarkable short-term success. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is actually outside of my district, but is one of the poorest municipalities in the nation, had the highest rate of school suspension only a few years ago in the state of Connecticut, by employing positive behavioral supports, all of the programming that comes along with it, by educating teachers and administrators about employing a PBS model. They were able to dramatically, in a very short period of time, lower their rate of school suspension, cut it by 1/3, and now are no longer at the top of the list. The bad news about that is that now at the top of the list is a school district in my district, the Waterbury Public School System, which has a 16 to 18% school suspension rate. So I'm really excited to be here. I think that we can do some very important things within the confines of the Bobby Scott's legislation on youth justice, but also with respect to the No Child Left Behind Act, where we can start to put some real incentive grant money behind school discipline programming that works. We have the data, we have the experts, we know what to do, we just have to start putting our money where our heart is and our money where the data is. And I think that probably starts with some really good incentive program funding. And then may ultimately in the future lie on the punitive side. I know in Connecticut we are talking about permanently ending out-of-school suspensions. We've been fighting that battle in the state legislature for a number of years. We have some fairly dramatic and strong pushback from school administrators, but every year that we fight this cause, we get a few more school administrators on our side. I mean, they're first and foremost concerned about a mandate without money, but more and more of them have come to believe what the data shows irrefutably, that when you send kids out of school for suspension, too many of them don't come back. Too many of them end up in prison, too many of them drop out, and that by having in-school suspension, not getting rid of suspension as a tool, but by having it within the confines of the school, you still give that system a chance to help that kid. Last thing I'll say as we're waiting for Representative Scott to come is that this issue is very personal for me at home. My wife is the head of the Connecticut Legal Services Unit for Children at Risk, and so every day she brings home the horror stories that you've heard about, and there are too many to recite, but zero tolerance policies of our schools is there for a reason, but it often goes way too far. And I think of the child that she's talked about around the state of Connecticut a lot, who 7-year-old kid who came to school with a pin from his Pokemon toy. A kid who's gone through foster homes over and over and over again. The one thing he loved in the world was this Pokemon toy. And so he brought to school a pin off of the toy, and in horsing around with another kid, he poked another girl with the toy. He was called up for expulsion. 8-year-old, 7-year-old kid came to school with what was termed as a weapon. And his entire life now, his entire educational career, his chance at making something of himself is thrown into jeopardy by the fact that he's now going to be tossed out of school. I understand why these policies are there, but there are far too many instances in which they are applied to a degree that ends kids' chances at some measure of success in life. And the Dignity in Schools campaign, the School to Prison Pipeline program are the type of things that we can learn from as we reauthorize the SCA, as we look to legislation that I've introduced, the Promise Act that Representative Scott has introduced, to give us even more imperative to get it passed. So with that, I'll turn it back over, but I really appreciate everyone for being here, and thank you so much to the panel for being part of this very important briefing.
And I want to thank Linda Foreman, who's also helped put this briefing on together. Mr. Scott's still not here, so we're going to go right ahead. Dr. Jackson has to catch a plane, and so we're going to go ahead and let him start, okay? Is it right here? Okay.
Good afternoon. I see a lot of, I know it's an important issue, serious issue. I see a lot of somber faces in here though. But I think we should be happy, and I am happy to see that so many people are here to invest their time and energy to begin to think about how we relieve these disparities and suspensions and expulsion, because it is a very important issue. So we should be happy about the investment. You know, Damien, it reminds me of an old man who decided to marry a young woman who decided, and he became, he's a very old man, he became ill, pulled his young wife by his bedside and said, "Promise me that when I die, you're going to bury me with all my money, because I don't want you spending my money on any other man." It came to pass, she made the promise, and it came to pass that the old man died. At the funeral, the young widow approached the casket with her girlfriend by her side. She pulled an envelope out of her purse, placed it in the casket, and began to walk away. Her girlfriend just shook her head and said, "Tell me, girl, you didn't keep the promise." She said, "I did, but I wrote him a check." So it's important that we make the type of investments that we can while we're here, and there's no other more important investment than the investment of saving our children and the investment in education, because there is a correlation between educational attainment and a community's economic base, educational attainment and a community's access to health care, but also correlation between educational attainment and incarceration. So while these great scholars and advocates will talk about the data that impacts, in many respects, black, brown individuals, it's really about addressing this issue for our country. Our president has set a goal, a 2020 goal, that we be a global leader in post-secondary educational attainment. In order to achieve that, we have to graduate 16 million more graduates above our current rate. We can't get there without graduating more black, brown, and native people within this country. So when we see dropout rates losing 1.2 million per year, it works against us becoming a global leader. And we know that these disparities that we are able to identify by race and ethnicity, who's more likely to be suspended, who's more likely to be expelled, who's less likely to be gifted and talented. I think that's why we are here to address this issue. It's not just about saving certain populations, but it's about putting this country on a trajectory to remain globally competitive, and at the same time beginning to live to the values that we hold true. In a couple of weeks, the Schott Foundation is going to publish a report, as we do every couple of years, on the performance of black males in public education. Why we focus on black males is because as we look at the performance of our educational system, it's not enough just to look at who's on the top, but we want to know what are the experience for those who are on the bottom. And in 46 of the 50 states, black males, as it relates to graduation, are at the bottom. A 46% graduation rate, 47% graduation rate nationally, which has declined since the last report 2 years ago from 48%. The other 4 states, Latino males are at the bottom. Now in the other 46 where black males are at the bottom, Latino males are second to the bottom. And I imagine if we begin to do a crossover analysis of suspension and expulsion policies related to dropout and graduation rate, we will see that these issues are merged. So this is a much more important issue than just dealing with one aspect of education, but it's connected to dropout rates, it's connected to graduation rates, it's connected to placing us on that 2020 trajectory. And we see places like New York City, which enrolls the largest number of black males with a graduation rate of 28%. And places like Indianapolis with a graduation rate of 19%. At the same time, that's why we have to start beginning to say, what is it going to be necessary to provide all students an opportunity to learn? This is a very important component of it. Providing opportunities where when individuals are challenged, or where individual or circumstances where discipline might be necessary, that we don't use disciplinary policies to negate a student's opportunity to learn, but we try to find other ways to ensure that we maintain their opportunity to learn, we increase their capacity. So I appreciate the fact, number one, that Congressman Bobby Scott has taken this on as he has continued along with Congressman Murphy. I appreciate the fact that all of you are investing your time here today, and I'm just happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone, to Congressman Murphy. Thank you for having us here, Congressman Scott. His office has been wonderful on these issues as well. I'm Damon Hewitt with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'm here representing my organization, but we're also here under the umbrella of a coalition that some of you are familiar with, but others of you may not know about yet, and that's called the Dignity in Schools Coalition, which grew out of an ABA effort initially, but now is a full-fledged entity of its own. And I count my colleagues, some of them on the dais with me, as part of the members of the Dignity in Schools Coalition. I'd also like to recognize Matt Krager, who's also an attorney at the Legal Defense Fund, who's one of the core group members, one of the organizers of their coalition. You'll see on the table of materials a statement from the coalition, a sign-on letter, which includes some likely suspects and some unlikely. Look for the letters NEA on that letter, signed on, to our platform and our prescriptions for what we can do in this reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, some call No Child Left Behind, in this last iteration, what we can do to address these issues of zero tolerance in school discipline. Now, at the Legal Defense Fund, we don't think about zero tolerance in a vacuum. We don't even think about school discipline in a vacuum. We think about the school to prison pipeline. And it's important to conceive of it that way for these reasons. Some of you are staffers for members of this body who serve on the Education and Labor Committee. Some of you are not. Some of you serve on the Judiciary or subcommittees. But whatever committee your member serves on, or whatever work you're doing day to day, these issues affect you. These pipeline issues affect you. Yes, it's an education issue, but it's also an economic justice issue. I just heard President Obama's speech this morning, and he talked about the economic imperatives, and he underscored the fact that education and prioritizing education is one of the biggest drivers of our economy in terms of how much we spend and don't spend, but more importantly, how much we invest or don't invest, and what happens on the back end. This is also, of course, a criminal and juvenile justice issue. Our Director Counsel for the Legal Defense Fund spoke yesterday to a large body at the National Urban League Conference, and he repeated a startling quotation, that a statistic I had actually never heard myself before yesterday, I'm ashamed to admit. He mentioned that of black men who were born between the years of 1965 and 1969, of those who did not finish high school, whether they were expelled or just left, almost 59% of them found themselves in prison at one point or another. 59%. Now, I'm using a stat that he used because I thought it was compelling, but I think it's further compelling because it's a stat about the generation that preceded most of the staff in this room. A generation that is coterminous and contemporaries of many of the members of this august body, of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And you can think in your own lives, in your own communities, about people who have been left behind. And think about what happens to their children, and think about what happens over the generations. So this school to prison pipeline problem is a problem that affects every facet of American life. Now, going back to the discipline context, we believe the problems with the pipeline start in school, right? They start in school and they also start in communities. The main drivers are many, but there's some indicia that we have. Primarily what we know about are the massive numbers of suspensions and expulsions. Now, I hope I'm not preaching to the choir here, maybe I am to some extent, but you should know that suspensions and expulsions in this country are way out of control. And we also have a third prong now, which is the use of police or law enforcement or school safety agents or resource officers, as they're called in some jurisdictions, as the disciplinary arm of schools. Schools are essentially trying to suspend, expel, punish, and even arrest their way out of what is essentially an education problem. We know that those youth who end up in juvenile detention, 40% or more of them at least, are students with unmet special education needs. That's just the ones that we know about that are documented. Some estimate as high as 60 or even 65 or 70% in some instances. So we know that there's problems we can address on the front end in school. That's in schools. That's where the investment comes in. Yet, we know that over the last 30 or so years, the number of out-of-school suspensions has doubled from 1.7 million in the mid-1970s to 3.4 and 3.5 million today. And expulsions, kicked out of school completely for the remainder of the school year, sometimes longer. In some jurisdictions are now over 100,000 per year. Over 100,000 per year. Now, there are children facing these problems in every jurisdiction that your members serve. And it's not just happening, again, at the school level, because once they leave school, what happens to them? I mentioned that stat about what happened to folks a generation or two ago. Well, we know what happens to these children now. They're the same children who end up being represented by many of my friends who are public defenders doing juvenile defense work. They're the same children who find themselves incarcerated long-term, the same children who find themselves locked in cycles of poverty that seem intractable. But there's something that we can do on the front end. Now, it's also important to note this too. In addition to being an education issue, an economic issue, and also a criminal and juvenile justice issue, it's also a racial justice issue. These issues affect children across the board, but there's some pretty disturbing racial disparities. We know, for example, that African American children are suspended at 3 times the rate of their white counterparts. We know that Latino children are suspended at 1.5 times the rate of their Latino counterparts. Now, it plays out differently in different jurisdictions. This is a nationwide scan. These numbers are based upon that. But there's some places where the disparities are even worse. I want to actually share some stats with you from a new report that is forthcoming from a researcher in Indiana named Russ Skiba and Dan Lawson, who's with the Civil Rights Project now in UCLA. They conducted an analysis of the Department of Education's civil rights data from the year 2006, which was drawn from over 9,000 middle schools across the country. And they found an overall suspension rate across these schools of 11%. 11% of students unduplicated have been suspended at least once. And they also found that in a subset of 18 large urban districts, the analysis revealed suspension rates of over 22% for all these students in these urban districts. Now, when you think urban, you think students of color, and it's typically the case. But when they did a particular analysis of black male students in the 9,000 districts overall, they found a suspension rate of 28%. 28% of these students. We as a nation cannot afford to lose these students. They're vital to me, they're vital to their families and their communities, they're vital to our economy, they're vital to our country. We're doing ourselves a disservice and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I look forward to the data that will be in the be included in the Shaw Foundation's report because I think it's informed and underlined an ongoing conversation and debate over the last several years that has really caused both the opinion makers and policy makers on the Hill, that's led educators, led criminal and juvenile justice professionals, people across the board to rethink what it is we're doing. One of the favorite things examples we like to cite at the Legal Defense Fund and in the Dignity in Schools Coalition is what happened in Clayton County, Georgia, where a juvenile court judge and school leaders and others realized, you know what, we have a problem here. They've been able to turn around their problem by implementing common sense policies, common sense solutions. It's not always easy, but what it takes is some investment, it takes some political will, and also a healthy dose of common sense. Some of my other colleagues will talk about the other dimensions of that problem, and Jim Freeman in particular will talk about how our drive for accountability can have unintended consequences in making this problem even worse and exacerbating it. But we know that there's a better way. We know about alternative methods of discipline, restorative justice, positive behavioral supports. We know that there's a better way for these students. We also know that there's more information that we need. And this is where you all will come in. In the reauthorization of the ESEA, we have an opportunity to move away and shift from a persistently dangerous schools label, because that's essentially what it is, toward a new framework, a new vision where we can actually foster safe and supportive schools. And it has to be more than just a rhetorical shift away from punitive measures. We also need information and data to figure out exactly what's going on across this pipeline. We need data on in and out of school suspensions. We need data on school-based arrests, which we currently don't have nationwide. We need data on referral to alternative schools, which in some places have been used as dumping grounds for students who do present challenging behavior. We need all these indicia to actually help us understand not just whether the school is dangerous or whether the school is safe. We need to understand the overall school climate, because that essentially is what we're trying to change, not just for the numbers and accountability, but for the sake of these children. We can get this data not just through enforcement mechanisms on the back end from the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Ed, not just through grant-based initiatives through the Department of Justice, not just on a voluntary basis through competitive grants from the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools. We need this across the board for every school district on a continuing basis. And more importantly, when we have this data, we need disparities, racial disparities, gender disparities, especially in combination, and also just an issue of excessive use of discipline to trigger automatic interventions and supports. Give a school district the funding, the mechanism, the technical assistance, what they need to actually shift from being a school that's throwing away our children's youth and potential towards being a school or a school district to actually invest in them and invest in our future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'd also like to thank everyone for taking time out of their days to come talk about this issue. It is certainly near and dear to all of our hearts, and it's heartening to us that you're all here. And I'd also like to thank Representative Murphy and Representative Scott, Linda for putting this together. This is a fun panel to be on, so thank you for that. I'd like to really just make 4 points in my time today. First, I just want to reiterate what Damon said about how important this is and how we really are in crisis mode in many communities around the country. So where I come at this issue from, what my perspective is I work with communities around the country, usually groups of parents and students who are working to improve their schools in their communities. And so I work in big cities like Philadelphia and New York and Miami, somewhat smaller cities like Toledo, Ohio, and New Haven, Connecticut, and rural areas like Robeson County, North Carolina. And what all these places have in common, and many others, the thread that binds them all is that they're all being devastated by zero-tolerance school discipline and what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. So if you go to those places and you talk to parents and students and you ask them what is the single biggest obstacle they see to getting a high-quality education in their schools, what they're likely to tell you is the excessive use of punitive discipline, of out-of-school suspensions, of expulsions, of referrals to alternative schools, school-based arrests, and referrals to law enforcement. So that's why it is so critically important to address this issue, particularly in ESEA, the opportunity directly in front of us. Second, I want to stress that the current version of ESEA has actually made this problem worse. And it's done it in a number of different ways. One is that what we've seen is because of the intense test pressure created by No Child Left Behind, schools are far less patient and tolerant of classroom disruptions, and they're far more likely to use exclusionary discipline to address them. In fact, the law provides a very strong incentive for schools to simply give up on their lowest performing students. And the quickest and easiest way to do that, unfortunately, is zero tolerance. And that's what we've seen all across the country. But there's more at work here. No Child Left Behind has also changed the culture within schools. Excuse me. High-stakes testing has changed what's going on in many communities. So in many communities, the type of education they're receiving is characterized by a dumbed-down curriculum and lots of filling in bubbles. And so students, frankly, are bored by that. They are more likely to act out because just as the quickest way to avoid, or the best way to avoid student misbehavior is to give them rich, engaging course material, the fastest way to have student disruption is to bore them with rote memorization exercises and practice tests. And that's what we've seen all across the country. So that brings me to the third point I want to make, which is not only has the current version of ESEA made the problem worse, the new version, the reauthorized version, has an opportunity to make a significant improvement. So not only the things that Damon mentioned about data and accountability, but in the new version, there's a great need for Congress to invest in multi-stakeholder, local or regional strategies to address the school-to-prison pipeline, similar to what, perhaps the same as what Representative Murphy was saying. One thing we have to do is address the over-reliance on law enforcement to handle school disciplinary matters. It is not the job of police to address every squabble between middle school students. It's not their role to have to deal with a teenager who feels like challenging adult authority. Because of course that is every teenager at some point in time, right? And that's not the job of police, that's not what they're trained to do, but that's what they're being asked to do in communities all around the country. They're being asked to be disciplinarians. And the result of that is the needless criminalization of hundreds of thousands of young people. So we need to help these communities find a better way. Fortunately, we have some great models to look to. Damon mentioned Clayton County. There are plenty of others. Denver, Colorado, we can look at. We can look at Baltimore for some of these things. The state of Florida, Birmingham, Alabama. These are all places where we've seen the dramatic effects when multiple stakeholders come together to find a way to dismantle their local pipeline. When they work together to implement prevention and intervention measures that we know are more effective at improving academic achievement, improving graduation rates, and making schools safer. Not to mention the fact that they're more cost-effective than zero tolerance. And this is, of course, very similar to the approach put forward by Congressman Scott in the Youth Promise Act. The only thing keeping us from doing that, from having many more examples of places that are dismantling their pipeline, is the fact that these are complex issues. The school-to-prison pipeline involves numerous actors, numerous institutions, police, schools, prosecutors, juvenile courts, social services agencies. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the years is that those agencies have too often failed to cooperate, communicate, and prioritize effectively. And if you've ever been in this situation, you know that first it can be really hard to get all those folks at the table together. And even if you do get them at the table together, it can be very difficult to have a productive conversation because of issues of turf and funding and those kinds of things. But if there's one thing that Race to the Top has taught us, is that the federal government has a unique ability to cut through all that, to cut through the funding issues and the turf issues, and to get the right folks at the table to have a real discussion about how best to meet kids' needs in their community. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, I can't help but think if Race to the Top had decided to put as a requirement that schools eliminate punitive discipline as a way to access funding, instead of removing caps on charter schools or removing any restrictions on using test scores to evaluate teachers, where we might have been. But nevertheless, we have another bite at the apple with ESEA. And this is a perfect opportunity for Congress to take these community-driven initiatives to scale and dramatically reduce the flow of young people to the justice system and improve graduation rates across the country. And for my final point, I just want to stress what zero tolerance means to the educational rights and opportunities of young people. You know, every state in their constitution guarantees the right to public education for every child. And you know, one of the more shameful parts of our history is that we haven't always lived up to that. The trend has been in the right direction, I think, over time. But even with the flaws in our implementation of that, that set of policies, probably more than any other, has done more to allow children of every race and socioeconomic background to succeed in this country and contribute to this country. But what we have now, where young people can be deprived of their education for weeks, months, even a whole year, and sent to the juvenile justice system for behavior that's developmentally normative, then there is no meaningful right to an education. What we understand of as rights are being stripped away by zero tolerance in the school-to-prison pipeline. And instead of trending in the right direction, we are now moving in the opposite direction, which is where we divvy up education based on who we think deserves it, right? So, and even if you're not concerned about students' educational opportunities and rights being eroded, if we don't address this, all of your other education priorities, whatever you hold near to your heart, whether it's curricular reform, school turnarounds, whatever it is that winds your clock and that you're working on, it's not going to have much meaning, if at all, if we don't do a better job of protecting students' rights to be in the classroom and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. Thanks.
Mr. Scott is just locked in. Mr. Scott, would like to say a few words before Professor Gregory starts?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry to be late. We had another event that was going on the other side of the Capitol, so I appreciate everyone being here, and I particularly want to thank our great witnesses for being here, because each year over 3 million students are suspended and over 100,000 expelled from school. Some of these children are arrested or sent to alternative schools for minor offenses. These excessive disciplinary practices disproportionately affect African Americans, Hispanics, and disabled students. Harsh zero-tolerance punishments have been shown to be an ineffective way to reduce behavioral problems and can lead to an unhealthy learning environment. In 1994, Congress required states to pass laws mandating expulsion for students who bring firearms onto school grounds. When it enacted the School-Free Zones, Gun-Free Schools Act, some schools unfortunately overreacted for fears surrounding school violence, and some school administrators developed a variety of harsh, zero-tolerance disciplinary policies where students are increasingly suspended and expelled for minor infractions. Some children have been handcuffed and shipped off to juvenile court for getting into minor skirmishes or for being unruly or disobedient. Additionally, adolescent and young children have been hauled off to jail and charged with adult crimes for cursing in front of teachers, shoving classmates, or participating in food fights. While appropriate discipline is an essential part of education, turning school children into criminals for minor offenses is unjust and counterproductive. In light of the upcoming reauthorization of the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and in pursuit of improving school climate and culture, it is necessary that we correct this problem. One of the things that we'd like to share is, of course, the research findings and suggestions made by our panelists, and we've reviewed their research and are very much impressed by that and wanted to share that research with you. There's a lot of things we're doing on crime policy, and I think zero tolerance is just an example of going off in the wrong direction. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the testimony. The testimony I missed is being recorded, so I'm going to see that in due course. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much for your attention today. Is this coming through? Yep. Okay, great. So as we're hearing from other panelists, we're beginning to see a very negative portrait of schooling developing here, and particularly for many students of color and especially for African American students when we think about disproportionate discipline. For many schools, the portrait also includes a climate of surveillance and mistrust, rigid zero-tolerance policies, and common use of suspension to address misbehavior, as we've been hearing. A visitor can walk into schools and experience prison-like characteristics of the environment. In fact, security measures are on the rise. A national study showed that 66% of students have observed cameras used in their school in 2007 compared to 39% in 2001. We don't actually know if surveillance is an effective measure to ensure school safety, but we fear that it negatively impacts the sense of trust and community. As surveillance rises, we also know that zero-tolerance approaches have spread. And in addition, as people have noted, there's been a dramatic increase in the rate of suspensions. And suspensions are not equal opportunity. We know that for the last several decades, there's been documentation that black students are 2 to 3 times overrepresented in suspension. In fact, in some of the schools that I've studied, we've seen over 50% of every single African American student in the school with at least one suspension. And so that is showing there's something very fundamentally wrong with those schools. And many people, I just want to note, assume that poverty drives these differences between groups in disproportionality. But there's been research to show that when statistically taking into account socioeconomic status, these trends are maintained. So black students from high or low income are at greater risk for being suspended. So this is imperative for us to think about in terms of the civil rights issue and equity in schooling. So now I've offered some research-based findings that we know schools are implementing more security measures, zero-tolerance suspending, and actually there's been some research to show the rates of suspension of black students have increased recently compared to the rates of other groups. So in other words, there's greater rates of black suspension compared to other groups. And so what does this mean for the climate of schools? We know we're hearing a lot about issues around school climate. And what does this mean for the climate of classrooms and for individual students' welfare? We've already heard that for individual students who are expelled or suspended, they're actually put at increased risk. So we know that while many kids enter with risk before they get suspended, it actually can increase through the process of suspension. So it can actually increase a student's negative trajectory over time. So it's easy to kind of spin a story. The student misses instruction, hangs out in the neighborhood, meets other truant youth, gets involved in a lot more serious rule-breaking behavior, and then becomes more alienated from school. And this is particularly pernicious in light of the achievement gap. We know that there's likely, as people have talked about, an interrelationship between kids missing instruction, being excluded from instruction, and falling further behind compared to other groups. So let's take a moment now to think about the climate of classrooms. So let me turn this around. What do high-quality classrooms look like? Well, the research that many of us have engaged in the field have found that teachers who have engaging lessons, they do quick, efficient interventions to lower negative behaviors. They have clear and consistent routines. They praise positive behavior. They focus on building trust and getting to know individual students. They rarely rely on reactive, punitive measures. In other words, they skillfully engage students and gracefully diffuse conflict without having to write referrals, call security, or send students to the principal's office. I'm sure you can all remember a teacher who has a very engaging lessons plans where they're able to do a very slight, what some people call a desist, to reduce negative behavior. Sometimes it's simply by standing by Caitlin and she'll stop shuffling around. Something very subtle. And it might, so in these subtle, we videotape teachers' instructions and we look for these kinds of subtle interventions that are effective in diffusing conflict as opposed to escalating and leading to a discipline referral. But now, in contrast, teachers who rely on office referrals, and they frequently demand students to leave their classrooms, they likely have poor classroom climate. In fact, when teachers are not effective at diffusing conflict and eliciting cooperation through dynamic instruction, they're communicating low expectations for students. So what are students learning from that? Perhaps they're developing a mistrust for one another, and which can, I've shown in some research, mistrust leads to a lack of cooperation, a lack of buy-in in the teacher's authority. So if students aren't developing those strong relationships with their students, they're not able to diffuse conflict as well. So these are the kind of smaller micro interactions in classrooms that I think can really lead to these longer negative developmental pathways we're talking about in terms of thinking through the prison to the school to prison pipeline. So now let's consider from a school-wide perspective, zero tolerance policies on school climate. School climate is multifaceted. It's been conceptualized in a range of ways. But briefly stated, it's the shared perceptions of the school as a place to work and learn, shared across adults and students. Some researchers, including myself, have found it useful to think of school climate through the lens of an authoritarian approach versus an authoritative approach. Some of you may remember that from the parenting styles idea of authoritative versus authoritarian. One recent study showed that authoritarian schools emphasized punishment, and they had higher dropout rates compared to other schools who demanded that students have high academic performance and cooperation. So simply stated, schools that were using punishment more often were worse off than other schools. In a recently published statewide study that I conducted with colleagues at the University of Virginia, I found that schools where students perceived supportive relationships and where they also perceived high structure, there was less student victimization in those schools and less bullying among students. I want to emphasize here that in a statewide study, there was great variation in how much victimization and bullying there was, and great variation in suspension rates. So some of the higher poverty schools were doing okay. So some schools are, we should be all turning to these schools to look for best practices. We found that overall the positive school climate was comprised of both high support and what we called high structure, where students felt rules were consistently and fairly enforced. And we differentiate that from zero tolerance policies. So these findings support a new appreciation for an authoritative approach to discipline, which emphasizes support over a rigid reaction to misbehavior. We know that students with positive teacher-student relationships simply have better outcomes. They have higher achievement, they have lower problem behavior, lower weapon use. So while that kind of might sound mushy-gushy, this idea of support is absolutely central, and it is a fundamental paradigm shift in terms of a discipline policy for us to think about moving away from exclusion and towards needs assessment and offering support. Such positive school climates are also important for reducing disproportionality and the exclusion of African American students. So in our research, we also found that schools low on characteristics of authoritative schooling had the highest school-wide suspension rate. So school climates characterized by low academic expectations and low adult support had the highest suspension rates for Black and white students. And another finding that I want to highlight here is that these schools had the lowest disproportionality between Black and white students as well. So those schools were doing the best in terms of having a narrower gap and having lower rates for both Black and white students. So in sum, rigid zero tolerance policies to rule infractions may have a chilling effect on the climate in the classroom and overall in the schools. We know from research that schools with the lowest racial gaps and the lowest suspension rates offer students supports, high expectations for achievement, and a sense of fairness in the application of rules. So thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to echo all of my panelists' thanks to Representative Scott and Representative Murphy for inviting us here today to speak on these really important issues. And I'm here from the American Civil Liberties Union of the nation's capital, which is the DC affiliate office of the ACLU. And I'm here to give a little bit of a perspective on the state and local level of how the work that Congress is doing to reauthorize the SEA can really make a big difference for the kids that we work with every day in our district and in our states. I represent students that are facing excessive discipline, harsh discipline, and are being denied the right to their public education because of these harsh disciplinary practices. And I want to tell you a couple of stories about my clients because I think it's a great way to see how these policies are playing out in the schools and how they're really affecting our most vulnerable students. But before I get into those policies, I do want to direct everybody's attention to a letter that we have out on the table from the ACLU about our priorities for the ESEA reauthorization and how those connect in. You'll be able to see how those connect in with the case stories I'm going to tell you today. And I also wanted to just give a shout out to my colleague Debbie Bagans over here. And if you have any questions about that letter and about some of the other priorities that I'm not speaking about in my experiences today, you can please direct those to her and she'll be happy to follow up with you. So the first story that I want to tell is about a student who was in 7th grade at a middle school here in DC. And they came to me because he was being suspended for 36 days of school. 36 days of school was till the end of the quarter because the school felt that it was easier to suspend a student through the end of the quarter rather than having to have them come back in the middle of the quarter and account for their grades. And 36 school days is, 7 weeks of school plus 1 day. So this is a really long time for the 7th grade student to be out. So I sit down and I start talking to the student and start talking to his grandfather who brought him into my office, and I said, well, what's going on in school? Why are you being kicked out for 37 days? And he said, well, I keep skipping class. I keep getting caught in the hallways during class. I said, okay, what's going on with that? Why aren't you in class? Why are you wandering the hallways? And he said, well, I don't like going to English. I said, okay, what is it about English that you don't like? He says, well, my teacher makes us read out loud in class, and I don't know how to read very well. I said, oh, okay, so here's a problem, because first of all, we're kicking a kid out of school for not going to school. There's no common sense there. He doesn't want to go to school, so he's skipping class, and our answer is to give him permission to sit at home for 6 more weeks. So that's the first problem we have with this type of discipline. The second problem is that we have a 7th grade student who's skipping class because he can't read. That means that there's an issue there, and that means that there's an issue there that the school isn't addressing. So through our advocacy, we were able to fight that suspension and then start the evaluation process for special education to find out what was it about this child, this student, that made it that he couldn't read. If there are any underlying issues there that maybe we could address through positive behavior supports, through extra school, through specialized instruction. And it turned out, of course, that he did have a learning disability that was affecting his ability to read and to write, and that the school was able to then provide the services that helped him succeed in school and to get better and to graduate, which he did from his 7th grade class to get promoted on to 8th grade. So that's one example of how harsh discipline affects some of our most vulnerable kids. Another example is another student who was in middle school, and this was a student who was a student in crisis. These are students that we see a lot of times in high poverty areas. Her family had moved 3 or 4 times throughout the course of the year. She was living with one parent, a number of siblings. She was the oldest, so she was often responsible for childcare, for being there for her siblings after school. And she was a little rough around the edges in school. She had just started in the school for the first year. She had just moved there from a different district. And she postured a lot. She liked to be the tough girl. And instead of supporting her and helping her, the school continually suspended her. And the school continually sent her home, sent her to in-school suspension, had her be missing her classes, not being able to succeed in her work. And she came to our door on a 45 or 46-day suspension through the end of the school year. This was in late April. And again, I asked what had happened, and what had happened was that she had cursed at her teacher. Okay? Not appropriate to be cursing at your teachers, of course, and that's not something that we support. But to suspend a student for 9 weeks of school who was already a student in crisis and who the school was very aware was a student in crisis is not going to help that student succeed and is not going to help that student be able to realize their education, to get the full benefit of being in school, and then to learn the lessons that she's going to need for the rest of her life in order to be successful through high school and beyond. And so what's so great about this panel and what all of my other panelists have talked about today is that we know that there are better ways to discipline students, and we know that there are better ways to deal with these challenging behaviors. And through the reauthorization of the SEA and the great work that everybody's doing here, we can incentivize states to use those great methods, and we can help encourage and teach states what methods work and how to use positive behavior interventions to keep students in school. So something that we'd really love to see is more of that in schools, and more support for students, more helping students work through these issues, and more opportunities for these students to continue their education. Because like in the first story I told, there's no good that's done by rewarding a student for bad behavior by sending them home from school. It doesn't make sense if you stop and think about it. And the fact that I was encouraged to hear about the idea in Connecticut to stop out of school suspensions and out of school punishment, because it doesn't seek to do anything for those students. My students don't get work home from them. They don't often have any way to make up work when they come back, so they come back to school after being out for a number of weeks with no way to catch up and no way to earn back those credits or to know what's going on in the classes. So having supportive methods in schools that both prevent the behavior from happening in the first place, but that also seek to address the behavior after it happens in school in a supportive way, I think is one of the most important things we can do through the ESEA. Then the other thing I want to talk just a little bit about, and I do want to make sure we have time for questions, is that we also need to be accountable for this type of harsh discipline, and we need to know where it's happening, why it's happening, and what behavior is causing students to be kicked out of school. Because that's something that's not widely available right now. So I think the data methods that Damon and others were talking about earlier are also very important for us to understand what behavior students are doing in school and how harsh and how overreactive the discipline sentences are. So I'm going to stop now because it's after 3 o'clock and allow for some questions. Thank you, everyone.
Panel of scholars and advocates, and Mr. Scott, Mr. Murphy, do you have questions that you want to put to the panel?
Let me ask you one, what are the dropout statistics after the suspensions? What happens to students who never drop, likelihood of dropping out?
Well, Jim may have some state level data, but what we do know is that these policies actually, I don't know about dropouts in particular, but we do know that these policies actually inhibit and reduce student academic achievement across the board, both for students who are suspended, expelled, or arrested, and those who aren't. There's an overall decrease in diminution in actual academic success. Jim may actually have some statistics on the state level though.
Except that I'm not remembering them at the moment. They are, though, I think in the report that should be over on the table that we published called Testimonials to Push Out, it references a number of those studies. Another place I might recommend that folks look for this research and for lots of other research on this subject. The American Psychological Association appointed a zero tolerance task force that did an exhaustive review of research on this subject, and so that question, as well as just about every other thing you can imagine about zero tolerance, is addressed in there. So I'd highly recommend it as well.
But what we'll do is we'll put our heads together and we'll get that information to you and your colleagues.
But it's clear that after they're suspended, if they were behind to begin with, they would be behind or when they come back, making it less likely that they'd ever catch up.
Right. Suspension, especially long-term suspension and also expulsion, have similar effects like retention in grade, making it much less likely that a student will ever graduate, particularly on the high school level. And at the middle school level, it has other effects that tend to manifest themselves later down the line as well. So even if it's a student who's in 6th or 7th or 8th grade, like the middle school students who were Caitlin's clients, they are likely to suffer the same dramatic implications down the line.
Yeah, I think the key issue here, in my opinion, is whether these students were inevitably going to drop out anyway, or was the contribution of the suspension itself. And there have been several studies that were very tightly controlled for entry risk into suspension and how the suspension actually exacerbated it. So I think that's some of the points I think we're making, that it can actually unintentionally contribute to negative trajectories.
I'm going to start with the first question, okay? Senator Scott. I've put up this data for the last 3 or 4, for a month actually, and wanted to know if you find any risk in concentrating on African American boys and Latino boys and leaving out girls in your studies. And I'm a gender specialist, so I'm concerned because I know that there's a high rate of African American girls being suspended, Latino girls leaving school. They may not go to jail, they may not be incarcerated, but these girls are getting pregnant, they are leaving school. So just want to know your input in terms of focusing on the male side of this, although I know the statistics are high, so just wanted your input on that.
Okay, well, I think that there are some compelling reasons to highlight what's happening with African American boys. There's some historic reasons. In your introduction, you mentioned that I consulted with some of the defense counsel who represented the so-called GINA 6. And we know that these young men are targeted. They are looked upon as some type of predators or predators to be. They are often singled out. It's just a simple fact. If we look at indicia of high academic achievement, they're at the low end of the spectrum. If we look at indicia of school exclusion, they're at the high end of the spectrum. The highest end of the spectrum, I should say, for both indicia. But what I think is important is that not just that we only do what it takes to improve the plight of the lot of black boys, African American boys, but that we actually get the data across the board on school climate, on arrest, suspension, expulsion, in and out of school, disaggregated by every measure. We need to do that so that we can see what the picture is, not just nationwide, but in your community, in your representatives' community, and in different districts in Virginia and Connecticut. We need to know what's happening, because we need school districts to have the flexibility to provide positive responses and positive interventions that are directly relevant to what's happening in their backyards.
If I could offer something, my organization, actually the first issue we ever worked on, we opened our doors 11 years ago, was this issue. And this was before the school to prison pipeline had a name. And the reason why we did this is, this was before I actually got there, but my boss was down in Mississippi doing some work on education issues, and what she was hearing, she was in the Delta, and what she kept hearing was stories of these students getting extraordinarily long out-of-school suspensions for very minor things. This issue wasn't on the national radar in any meaningful way at that time, and then she heard about the same students getting referred to the juvenile court for this, right? And so these were 4 black students in Mississippi Delta. And, I'm a subscriber of Montgomery's theory of the miner's canary. That if you pay attention to what's happening to the most vulnerable members of our society, then you can pretty well predict what's coming down the line for everybody else. And that's exactly what happened with this issue. Pretty soon, the same policies that were being used in rural Mississippi started spreading all over the country. So now, in the last 6 months, probably folks in this room know who Zachary Christie is, right? The 6-year-old in Delaware who was all over the New York Times because he brought his Cub Scout knife to school and he got 45 days in alternative school, right? Little suburban white cute kid. Because now this issue is affecting more and more students, more and more communities. So I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening to black men, but you're exactly right that suspension rates, expulsion rates, rates of referrals to juvenile court are on the rise for everyone. And that's why this is not only important as a question of morality and justice, it's also important politically because it's affecting more communities than ever before.
Can I just ask a question about special education eligibility? And Caitlin, you talked about the fact that a lot of these kids are already years behind. And so do we have data or evidence about how many of the kids that get into these types of suspension or expulsion issues have gone through a PPT, have been identified for special education issues, and whether entering into that discipline pipeline makes you any more likely to get hooked up with special education services if that identification as a discipline problem ever leads you to get identified as someone who is in need of a special education plan?
I don't have numbers, and I'm going to turn that over to other folks who may have some better idea about that, but I do want to talk about the idea of discipline as a way to get hooked up with services, and we found that that doesn't happen very often unless you have a lawyer. And so my clients get hooked up with services often, and colleagues of mine's clients get hooked up with services, but in most places, there aren't a lot of attorneys and representatives doing this type of work for students who have not yet been identified as students with disabilities. And so I don't think it often is a problem. I think what happens instead is that those students are not identified, are kicked out of school for a period of time because they're perceived as being problem children, or they have behavioral issues, or they're challenging. And then they don't get those services because they're out of school. And so I think, I don't know what the numbers look like, but that's certainly been our experience in DC. Yeah, I don't know if there are any.
So I don't know of any comprehensive studies looking at that. Other folks might. I don't know. I've just never seen one. What I can say is my experience working on this issue in a number of different states. It's almost never the case that leads to better special ed services. But that's a really important point because there is this myth among educators, among school officials, that they're doing kids a service by referring them to the juvenile court system. We hear this all the time. They'll get the help they need. So, one thing that we have to make abundantly clear for the school districts we work with is that the consequences are dire, and only in the very best systems around the country is there a realistic chance of improving that young person's life outcomes. And even so, I think you can make a pretty strong case that there's just far better ways to do it. So yeah, I've never seen that.
Any questions?
Hi, I'm former president of the Montgomery County NAACP youth group. So what we found in you guys' studies, have you ever found that stereotypes have been a big factor with regard to the high suspensions? Because I know, at least from the kids that I counseled and my group counseled, it was more based on stereotypes. There was one thing that stuck out with me: all black men can fight. So it was like, and I blame the media for that too. The media is not innocent in this case either. So it just seemed that they had to try to prove that the kids tried to have felt that they had to prove that they were just like that or something. It's like they were falling into the stereotypes because peer pressure, did that to them. Or they would rebel against what they were supposed to do. And, okay, teacher says, well, you're going to be a failure anyway. And then you rebel and say, no, I'm not, but you end up doing it anyway. That's what a lot of kids end up, doing. But
Thanks for bringing that up. I think you're bringing up the complexity of this phenomenon when kids take in a media image into their identities. And so you're talking about the process of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there has been some research done to show that happens with low expectations about achievement. So if teachers communicate low expectations to students in very subtle ways, maybe even just going up to a student too many times to look over their shoulder, students can take on that sense of, I'm really not good at this enterprise. And in fact, their achievement can decline over time. There hasn't been good research, parallel research, to look at internalization of these stereotypes around aggression or bravado. So it's a really good point that you're bringing up. Some scholars have talked about this notion about the code of the street, and the idea of the need to bring in kind of a defensive urban posturing into a school setting, and that could be a misplaced kind of bringing that in. Even though it's useful in the street for defensive purposes, it could backfire in the school setting. But I think you're bringing up a good point.
Right. I think that stereotyping does happen. Stereotyping even happens after the initial behavior is encountered. So, for example, Russ Skiba, the Indiana researcher, has a study that indicates that African American students are punished or disciplined more harshly for engaging in the exact same behavior. So stereotypes come from that end. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of what work we need to do with students to promote, I think it's all part of promoting positive school culture and environment. But I also point to Representative Scott's Youth Promise Act as a way to address some of those larger problems as well.
And if I could add just one thing to that, is I think we have to be careful in looking at this issue and thinking about this being as the effect of young people acting differently. What we found, and I think Damon's, your experience is the same, is that this is much more the effect of a change in adults' behavior than kids' behavior, than young people's behavior. That we have gotten worse, we as adults have gotten worse at dealing with challenging behavior from youth, right? So Representative Scott mentioned the Gun-Free Schools Act. That's what most people think about when they think about zero tolerance, about keeping guns out of school, about keeping kids from selling drugs in school, that kind of thing, right? I was just looking at some data yesterday, school district, 25,000 students, over 1,000 referrals to juvenile court in 1 year. Of those 1,000, how many do you think were weapons related? One out of those almost 1,100, right? You go through the list of what kids were referred to juvenile court for. These are kids as young as 8 years old, wandering the halls, being argumentative. Pages of kids who were argumentative and were referred to juvenile court. Getting in arguments, using profanity. Sure, this is annoying behavior, right? And there should probably be some consequence for a lot of these things. But what we've done is ratchet up the consequences. So ratchet up the consequences for posturing, for responding to stereotypes, right? Responding to stereotypes is certainly nothing new. But what's changed is how we as adults have decided to treat that behavior.
Any other questions? Do you have any stats on the Latino young people? And I'm specifically speaking in terms of the context that our community finds ourselves in right now, with all of the anti-immigrant sentiments out there in the community and schools, whether kids are documented or not, whether the Constitution says that they belong, they have a right to public schools. Do you have any data? Do you have a sense of whether that's affecting whether kids are actually being pushed out of schools if teachers or principals don't feel like they belong there?
Well, the general stat, I'm not sure if you heard earlier, is that nationwide, and colleagues correct me if I'm misstating this, but Latino students are 1.5 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. And that statistic in of itself, somebody say, well, it's only, it's more or whatever, but it's certainly a problem. it's certainly a problem to us. There are obviously unique populations for which, I'd say ELL students generally, that have a more complicated host of issues that they face. And the stereotypes, I think, from the outside come into play there. I don't have any statistics beyond that. I'm not sure. Jim, I know Jim has done a lot of work, the Advanced Project has done work with Padres and Jóvenes Unidos out in Denver. And I know that they've looked at these kinds of issues. I don't know if you have data to share.
The one thing about school discipline data is there tends to be a lag time on it. So in response to Arizona in particular, I don't think we have much to share. Although, Dan mentioned Denver, one thing that comes to mind is we are seeing anecdotally some effects of what's going on in Arizona. So in Denver, for example, there was a school, it was May 5th, and there were some students on the playground who had the Mexican flag and were running around with the flag. May 5th in other communities is known as Cinco de Mayo, but yet the teachers of the school took the flag away and said, you're suspended for a week. And so some other kids stood up and said, why are you doing that? They're just celebrating their culture, celebrating their heritage. And those kids were all suspended too for a week. So they suspended 20 kids for a week. And so the parents heard about it. Parents came to school to question, why are we suspending kids for a week for celebrating Cinco de Mayo in school? And they called the police. So next thing you know, the school is surrounded by police because apparently the school feels threatened that folks are concerned about their kids getting an education. So yeah, this stuff is happening like that. I mean, as Damon mentioned earlier, we have national data on racial disparities for Latino students. We have there's data, I think, in our report on particular communities and different places where we have data. The one thing I would say in this area, the data tends not to be as good because schools and law enforcement agencies aren't as good about collecting data about Latino students. They're frequently misclassified as white. But the disparities are clear.
Any more questions? Liz, did you have an answer your question?
Oh no, I did have a question. It was in regards to the follow-up of the dropout rates. I was wondering, do you have any data that shows these students who are being set back for their suspension 6 to 9 weeks and missing a whole grade period? I can't imagine them being promoted to the next grade. So do you have data that's showing how many kids are being held back?
You all raised some very intriguing questions, and I think we're going to get the specific data answers to these and get them to Representative Scott, Representative Murphy, and other colleagues. But we know Bob Belfans has done work on the dropout factors. Depending on what measure you use, 1,000 to 2,000 dropout factors across the country. And we know that there's lots of correlations between schools with what they call low promoting power, students not being advanced to the next grade and eventually graduating from high school, and schools that use some of these harsh discipline policies. Matt Prager in my office at the Legal Defense Fund is actually, with a group of colleagues, taking a look right now at what those dropout factors are doing in terms of discipline to pull out some anecdotes and also some data where appropriate to give a more precise answer to that question. We think that kind of analysis will be very useful in the run-up to ESEA reauthorization. It's not the precise question or answer that you articulated, but I think it takes us a long way because we know that there's a correlation. It's just a matter of actually conducting the analysis to prove it.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a study where the author, researcher looked at authoritarian schools and schools that relied more on suspension rates had higher dropout rates, and that was controlling for lots of other confounding variables. So I'm happy to pass that on to you because I think it was a well-controlled study.
Do any of the staffers have questions? Okay, anybody else have one more question? We can wrap it. We're over our time now.
I just want to know if we could get Congressman for you guys if we want to follow up with further questions.
All the material has that.
Is that in here?
We'll make sure you have it.
Yeah.
We'll make sure you have it if you don't.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for the wonderful work.
I wanted to thank all of our panelists. This is excellent information. Educational achievement is so closely correlated with the child's future. If a child doesn't get a good education, they're more likely to be involved in crime, more likely to be a pregnant teen, more likely to drugs, and of course more likely to drop out. And dropouts are highly correlated with all kinds of social problems. And when you throw in zero tolerance and suspend children from their educational opportunity and put them on a track where their achievement will actually go down as a result because you've gone all these weeks with no education, they started out behind. When they come back, they're going to be even further behind and more likely to get on that trajectory for bad outcomes. So I want to thank you for all the information you've given us on zero tolerance. Thank all of our panelists, but also we want to thank Linda Macias for bringing us together. This is her idea. She put the panel together, so we want to thank her. She is a Rye Fellow who has been in office 7 months. I was going to say a year. She's been with us a long time, doing this kind of good work. And tomorrow is her last day. So thank you, Linda, for all your hard work and particularly for putting this panel together.